Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the book of Exodus, Deliverance and Constitution. I'm John Walker, and I'm along with others in this on this virtual platform. I'm with Bruce Wadzeck, the minister of the Princeton Church of Christ. Bruce, if you would, share what are the three lenses through which we should look at the 10 plagues God brought to Egypt?
Well, I'm using three lenses because if you looked at it the way that the Jews who would have looked at it to begin with, and the writer as they originally wrote it, would have had only two lenses to look at this material. But we live in a scientific era, and so consequently, this is a third way to look at what is taking place here. We're talking about the 10 plagues that God brought on the Egyptians to force them to let his people leave slavery and to go and worship him. Now, if you look at it from a scientific viewpoint, what some people would like to point out is that there had been a few times in the history of Egypt where events similar to this have occurred, kind of in sequence. And so what some will say is, well, that's all that we have here is just, it just happened a series of natural catastrophic events occurred, and that's all that we're seeing here. But I think as we look at this, we'll see that that's not a likely possibility. But I'll go through the scenario this way. We have to understand where Egypt was and why Egypt was a great country in the ancient world. And that's first of all because of their isolation. They were a difficult country to get to, surrounded by deserts and the Mediterranean. And so enemies had to travel long distances. Number two was that they had this huge Nile River that was supplied with plenty of water way upstream that flowed throughout the year, and yet they were in a semi-arid area. But what made them so important and influential was the fact that once a year, almost every year, there was an annual flood where the Nile would overflow its banks. It would bring rich topsoils down from way upriver and deposit them all over the Nile Delta. And thus you would have an annual fertilization of your crops that would occur in a natural way. And so they were the breadbasket of the ancient world. They were not only able to feed their people, but even down the time when Rome, we were talking about thousands of years later from where we are now, I'm talking about the plague, they were still the breadbasket of the ancient world because of that unique situation of their environment, the flood, then lots of sun, and they prospered. Now, if it failed to flood enough, then of course there was deficiencies. But the other side could occur too, and that could be you could have too significant a flood that might bring down so much topsoil that it choked out the oxygen in the water. And that would result in killing off many of the fish. And we do know that occasionally that happened throughout the history of Egypt. We have some recorded by the Egyptians, some recorded by Herodotus, a Greek historian, and others in more recent history. Now, all of that ceased in our modern era because they built this huge dam in order to get electricity from the Nile, and so it no longer overflows its banks. And they have to fertilize their crops like everybody else does in our day. But in the ancient world, they had one of these unique situations. And what some people would say from a naturalistic viewpoint is, well, they had one of these huge overflow events. And so the first plague was that the water looked like blood, which meant it was very reddish, which would bring, it was bringing that kind of topsoil down. And that there was so much of it, that it choked out the oxygen. And so the fish were dying. And then, of course, the frogs was the next infestation. And of course, If the fish couldn't live in the water, the frogs would have to get out of the water. And of course, then they died. They plagued the people for a while, but then they couldn't get back in the water. They died. And then your mosquitoes and flies would feed on these dead fish and frogs, and they could have spread disease, some kind of anthrax or other disease, to the livestock of Egypt. And then human beings would also get infected, and that's where the boils would come in. So that sort of thing happened a number of times, even as recently as I think like 1820 in Egypt. But as you go beyond those opening things, you really don't find any correlation. And that's just a warm up of the things that are happening in the plagues that God is bringing. In addition to that, he brings a tremendous hailstorm on them. And you can't really fix that into the normal natural progression of things. And then a great darkness comes afterwards. It said the darkness you could feel. Perhaps that's describing a severe dust storm. So you can see how naturally some of those things might occur. But here's the point. Even if every one of those happened in sequence, how in the world would Moses know and be able to say, here's when it starts. I'm going to lift up my rod. It begins now. I'm going to pray right now as soon as I get out of the city, or tomorrow morning I'm going to do this and it's going to go away. Well, today, with all our meteorological satellites, with all our prognostication, we would be hard pressed to be able to be as precise as Moses was. But of course, there was no such way to be able to predict those things. So first of all, even if God used certain natural factors, the key here is that God had it and the timing exactly when Moses said it would happen as he spoke for God. And that couldn't happen in the normal course of things at all. It just wouldn't happen. So I think that's one of the things. Plus, there's been no instance in history where all of these things have followed in succession. And of course, the 10th and final plague was the killing of the firstborn, not killing of your children, but the firstborn only out of the family. Now, I saw a TV special where they tried to explain that scientifically, but I think, they were really pressing their luck on that particular explanation. They said the firstborn, if you had a shortage of food, he got fed before the others, and perhaps the seed was contaminated, so that killed the firstborn because they got fed. Well, if you didn't feed the other kids, they'd die, so I don't know how that helped. But anyway, my point is, I don't think you can explain all this in a naturalistic way. So that's the way we would tend to explain things in our scientific world today. But in the world in which the Bible was written, the Egyptians and the Hebrews both would have thought in terms of two other things, two other lenses to look at what was going on. One would be the fact that they believed that there were many gods and that these gods affected the weather. Matter of fact, the Egyptians had a goddess, Habi, who was the goddess of the Nile flooding and overflow. They even had a goddess in charge of that, who was also the goddess of fertility. And so, because they believed there are many gods involved in this, then what we have here is a conflict between the Hebrews' God, who claimed to be the supreme and creator God, and Pharaoh, who claimed to be a god, and all the gods of Egypt. Who's going to win that conflict? And so that's how the Egyptians and the Hebrews would have looked at this. It was a conflict between the gods that was manifesting itself in what we call nature or natural catastrophic events. Now, we know that this is the case because, John, if you have it, it's chapter 12 of Exodus, verse 12 highlights this.
On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord.
I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. So this was a conflict between the Lord and the gods of Egypt. And as I mentioned, Habi would be one of the gods that would be involved in this. They also had a goddess who had a head like a frog, and she was another fertility goddess. And of course, their chief god was the sun god, Ra. And of course, when you're able to bring darkness for 3 days in a row and shut the sun out, that shows that you have greater power than Ra has. So there are numerous other gods and goddesses that could be brought into this discussion that had influence, but I don't think we're that interested in all the details of Egyptian religion and their gods and goddesses. But the point we want to get in all of this is that the Bible is framing this as a conflict between the one true God who is coming to deliver his people. He's coming to the mightiest nation state in the world. He's coming to a place that believes in many gods and who believes their leader, Pharaoh, is Horus incarnate, that he is a living God. And of course, the Egyptian worldview was that it was Pharaoh's responsibility to maintain ma'at, which was a Hebrew word for order, meaning that, you know, the floods would come at the right time, the crops would grow, people would be protected, and prosperity would reign. All of that was achieved in contrast to chaos and disorder by Pharaoh maintaining ma'at. He did that by his ritual behaviors along with the priests of the various gods and goddesses of Egypt. That's what they believe made the world tick. And so this is all being challenged by what Moses brings. Of all things, this oppressed people who you would tend to say, well, these oppressed people, their God can't be very important. We've enslaved them and he hadn't done anything about it. But they're fixing to find out that's not the case. And the third lens is a creational, decreational lens. There are a number of different expressions in the book of Exodus that show that the writer is thinking about Genesis chapter 1. First of all, he talks about, to begin with in Exodus, that the people of Israel increased in number and filled the land that they were in. The same terms that was the mandate of God to Adam and Eve and their descendants. And also, what we see is that God is kind of doing a uncreation. He's undoing creation. Just like in the original creation, you started out in darkness, and then God brought light, and then the earth, and it was plentiful, and then animals, etc. Well, you start looking at what God does here. He ends up with creating 3 days of darkness. So he's undone creation. You know, he's brought water to cover the earth and bring destruction, like the great flood. But also water covered the earth to begin with in Genesis chapter 1. And again, instead of animals living and crops flourishing, the opposite occurs in these plagues that God brings, which shows it's God that brings about the blessings of these things, and he can take them all away. It's God that's in control. So that would be a second lens, if you will, the creational vision that God is in charge. He's proving he's in charge by doing the opposite of bringing a good creation, by bringing destruction upon the Egyptians because of what they have done. And so we'll keep those kind of themes in mind as we pick up the story at the beginning of the first plague in Exodus chapter 7.
Beginning at verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river. Confront him on the bank of the Nile, and take your hand, the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now, you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish of the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water, but because they could not drink the water, because they could not drink the water of the river. Bruce, who are these magicians of Pharaoh?
Yeah, they're translating magicians. I think that probably doesn't resonate too much with us. We think of sleight of hand tricks, but these magicians were high priests of the religion of the Egyptians, and they knew certain secret arts. They could do things because they had learned how to do some things that were quite influential. As we saw, they were able to make their staffs become snakes and then pick them up again. And so they had some skill at this. But these were the wise people of Egypt that knew all the secrets. And of course, Egypt probably knew as many secrets to healing people. We find out as we look back through time, they were way ahead of all the other nations because they were the first mighty nation. And so this is going to be a conflict, not just between Moses and Pharaoh, but Pharaoh brings in his heavy hitters, these wise men, sorcerers, magicians, high priest of the religion in Egypt in order to confront him. Now notice, they're not able to undo the blood or the redness of the river. All they can do is replicate. So all they're doing is adding to the problem. They're not really solving anything. So they don't have the power to undo what God has brought at Moses' command. And notice, I mean, think about this. You know, you've got to have some water to survive. They might have a little on hand, but they were forced to dig down beside the Nile and filter the Nile water through these ditches in order to get anything to drink at all. And so they were in a catastrophic position, although this only lasted for a short period of time. But it definitely showed God's power over what? The most important life source in Egypt. You know, if you can control the Nile, then you're in control of their destiny. But because the magicians were able to take some water and turn it reddish, then Pharaoh took the attitude, well, this is just trickery. My magicians can do this. I'm not giving in to your demands, and I'll let your people go. That's not going to happen at all. So This is the first confrontation, and it's ended. And again, we see the constant theme is that Pharaoh, because he believes he's a god, is hardening his heart, because to admit that Yahweh is the Lord and is greater than he would be a total denial of what his role was. If there's a God that's against Pharaoh, that's greater than Pharaoh, that doesn't support Pharaoh, then there's no need for a Pharaoh. And periodically, when they had a series of famine years, etc., they get rid of a whole dynasty of pharaohs, and then a whole new one would arise again. Because if you can't keep my order, then who are you? So this is the threat that's on Pharaoh throughout this whole event. If you can't keep order here, if Moses is able through his God to overthrow order and resulting in chaos, then what future does Pharaoh have? But then the next plague goes on, beginning in chapter 8.
7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to them, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt.' So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same things by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord.' Moses said to Pharaoh, 'I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile.' 'Tomorrow,' Pharaoh said. Moses replied, 'It will be as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile.' After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said." Bruce, you mentioned this briefly. Did the magicians make it any better?
Yeah. So Pharaoh is satisfied they seem to be able to duplicate what Moses and Aaron were able to do. But of course, adding more frogs to a frog infestation is not exactly helping. They showed no ability to stop what was going on. And of course, as we think about the situation with the fish dying in the water, obviously the frogs who are amphibious are going to be able to get out of the water. And so perhaps feeding off some of the fish, et cetera, there was a great infestation of them. And at the command of Moses, not before, not after, they came on the land, and just, can you imagine, frogs everywhere? Because Egypt at that time was a series of canals and rivers. No one lived very far from water. And so frogs coming out of these places would have covered the entire land. And so this is the second great plague. And of course, you see Pharaoh saying, "Oh, well, I'll let you go worship. Just take this plague away." And so then Moses says, "Well, I'll give you the honor of deciding when we do this." And Pharaoh said, "Tomorrow." And so God did just as Moses requested, just as Pharaoh wanted it done. And so again, showing the power to turn on and turn off these plagues. And of course, the end result was they had stacks of frogs reeking all over the land as they died. Not a pretty sight at all. But you'd think perhaps this would cause Pharaoh to reconsider, but instead we find again and again he has a hardened heart and won't let the people go. They are a rich source of labor, and he's not willing to let them go. And his pride's involved in this as well. If I am a God over these all people, and the Egyptians are superior to all people, then there's no way that I should be defeated by these Hebrews' God. And so there's the conflict, the pride of Pharaoh against the power of God. But of course, didn't end there. The plagues continue.
Verse 16, then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord said. What were the magicians forced to admit here?
Yeah, isn't it fascinating? Here they had, stood beside Pharaoh. They had acted like these are just tricks you're pulling out. We can duplicate what you're doing. But when it comes to making gnats, and we're not sure whether this is gnats or mosquitoes or some other kind of insect, from the Hebrew word, we're not absolutely sure. But whatever it was a great nuisance. And the magicians and priests of Egypt said, we can't duplicate this. This is the finger of God. This is clearly an act of God. So they're warning Pharaoh, look, this is beyond trickery and deceit and certain hidden secrets. This is God himself acting. And so you should beware. But just as God had said, Pharaoh will harden his heart and he will not be open to letting the people go. So the plagues continue.
Then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and into their houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day, I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will occur tomorrow. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials throughout Egypt, and the land was ruined by flies. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go, sacrifice to your God here in the land. But Moses said, that would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, as he commands us. Pharaoh said, I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me. Moses answered, as soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Then Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained, but this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. Bruce, what new element is added here by God?
Yeah, so it appears during the first couple of plagues that the Israelites suffered right alongside the Egyptians. The Nile turned red for them too. But here, Moses says, God's going to show you a sign, Pharaoh, and that's going to be that this infestation of flies is going to be on the Egyptians, but in the land of Goshen, where all the Israelites live, they're not going to be affected by it at all. Now, that's not a commonsensical thing. If there's fly infestation, they're going to go all over habitable land. But that's what happened. And so it was another sign to Pharaoh that he was fighting the real living God. Now, when it talks about flies infesting the land, the flies in Egypt are not like the flies here that are kind of a nuisance. These flies that are native to Egypt bite people and bite animals. They're vicious little critters. And so, on top of just having them all around, they're biting people, biting animals. It would have been almost an unbearable experience. So notice God's kind of ratcheting things up. Every plague, he's turning up the heat and making the suffering greater. And of course, the whole point is ultimately Pharaoh must give in or he and his nation will be destroyed. And again, he said, "Oh, I'll let the people go. Just don't go too far," he said. But then as soon as the flies were gone, and Moses interceded and prayed for him, he went right back to his usual stance. Nope, not going to let you go anywhere, not go anytime, not go at all. So we're right back where we started again. So then there's another plague that God brings on the Egyptians.
Chapter 9, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die.' The Lord set a time and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go." Bruce, what did Pharaoh decide to investigate here?
Well, so the first time that he was told the plague that's going to come on you isn't going to come on the Israelites, well, he said it again. And so this time Pharaoh said, that can't possibly be. So he sends people over to investigate and discovered that this plague of the livestock dying came on his people and not on the Israelites. And so another clear sign that God is at work on behalf of the Hebrew people. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is, for example, the language said all the animals died. The Hebrew word there translated all can probably doesn't always mean every single one of them. It meant a significant portion of the animals, because we find later that there were some animals left in the land. It's kind of like in the conquest narratives when it said that, and Joshua slayed all the people in the land of Canaan, not a one was left breathing. Well, if you took that literally, you'd think there wasn't going to be a single Canaanite left. And yet you keep reading Joshua, it names all these major cities that are still fully inhabited. They have lots of Canaanites still alive in the land. These are generic statements, not intended to be absolute statements. I think the same is true here. So just so we're aware. But the point was the livestock started dying, and the Hebrews' livestock didn't die. So what's going on here? But he would not let the people go, still stubborn, hard-hearted. So God brings another plague.
Verse 8, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. Bruce, how did this plague affect the magicians?
Yeah, it's interesting how they highlight that the boils were so bad on their hands and feet, they couldn't even show up for a meeting with Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron were walking just fine, and the Egyptians were infested with these boils all over their body. But the Hebrews, they didn't have that problem at all. And so notice he's beginning to hit them with more than just temporary problems. Now, the boils is something you'd have for a while and you get over it. The river was red for a while and then stopped. The gnats or mosquitoes came and went. The flies came and went. But the livestock, when they died, they didn't come back. Now, there are clearly some livestock left because he refers to them in this text. So there were still some of their animals that were left, but they were also affected with the boils that came on the human beings too. So now we're talking about their livelihood. And as we go on to the next couple of plagues, we find he strikes at the very heart of their existence. Because when you destroy the cattle, you don't get the cattle back after the plague is over. They're gone. And so he's going to do something similar to that in the next plague.
Verse 13, then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in, and it is still out in the field, and they will die. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. But those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on people and animals, and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. "This time I have sinned," he said to them. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." Moses replied, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail, so you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God. The flax and barley were destroyed, since the barley had headed and the flax was in bloom. The wheat and spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripened later." Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts, so Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. Bruce, this time, what was Pharaoh forced to admit?
Well, we see that finally he admits that he's done something wrong. He admits and tries to take kind of responsibility for the situation. But notice that what Moses tells him is, well, I know you're going to resist God's purpose, and that's why this is all being done. This is being done to teach your people, the greatest nation in the world at that time, as well as all the other peoples that will hear about it, of what the Lord did to you through these mighty acts. And so God's reputation will spread. Now, notice some of the people, when they heard about the hailstorm coming, they took what Moses said seriously and acted on it to protect their animals and their people. But some, of course, took a lackadaisical attitude, and they suffered the consequences. Many of them were killed. Now, I don't know whether you've ever experienced a hailstorm of such magnitude, but I have memories of when I was growing up of occasionally being a real severe hailstorm. I remember going out in the backyard of my house and picking up hailstones that were the size of baseballs, not quite the size of softballs, but the size, right, kind of in between maybe a baseball size and a softball size. Huge, huge things. If that hit somebody, it could easily kill them. Hit an animal, it could kill them. And so these kind of severe hailstorms, now we're killing people, we're destroying your crops, destroying your trees. This hail is just bombarding everything. And so now we're eating into their survival. If your animals are killed and your food sources are destroyed, how are you going to survive? He's attacking their very potential survival. And so Pharaoh kind of asked him to please intervene again. But when he saw that the rain and the hail had ceased, he sinned again. And he said, no, he hardened his heart and he refused to let the people go. So just time after time, as soon as the dilemma is gone, Pharaoh goes from being, begging Moses to do something to being hard-hearted again and unwilling to let God's people leave. And so then we have this very significant plague that occurs next, the plague of the locust.
Chapter 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials so that I may perform these signs of mine among them. that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They will fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your parents nor your ancestors have ever seen from the day they settled in this land till now. Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh. Pharaoh's officials said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? Then Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. Go, worship the Lord your God, he said, but tell me who will be going. Moses answered, we will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord. Pharaoh said, the Lord be with you. If I let you go, along with your women and children, clearly you are bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you have been asking for. Then Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over Egypt so that locusts swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail. So Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all the day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take the deadly plague away from me. Moses then left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. And the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which caught up the locust and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Bruce, how was Pharaoh forced into negotiating with Moses?
Yeah, so imagine the hailstorm's over. A bunch of your animals that remained are dead. A lot of your people have died. It's beaten down your crops, knocked everything that might be growing on your trees off. I mean, it's devastated the land. And now even his own officials are telling him, you've got to let these people go. Can't you see they've ruined Egypt? So for the reputation of Pharaoh, for the future of Egypt, his people were telling him, you got to let them go. Well, Pharaoh says, well, I'll negotiate shrewdly with them. All right, so you want to worship. Well, just take your men and go out and worship. And when you're through, come back. Because he had the women and children and livestock and stuff would stay behind. And so pretty much Pharaoh would have them as a hostage. So he knew the men would come back. They wouldn't continue to leave. And, Moses said, no, we want to take everybody, including animals, if we're going to go out to worship. And so Pharaoh said, oh, you're just up to no good tricks. I'm not going to negotiate with you anymore. So just as God had said, he brought a locust plague. Now, I don't know whether you've ever experienced a locust infestation. I have some very vivid memories. And just today, I went on the internet and I was checking about locust infestations in West Texas, where I live. And sure enough, there were 1954, 55, 56, 7, there was a number of major infestations, because and that was when I was a very young kid, 5, 6, 7 years of age. Here's what I remember. I remember my mother having to go somewhere downtown to pick something up. I remember me walking out of the house, and the entire ground appeared to be moving. These grasshopper locusts were jumped up all over you. You know, you couldn't step anywhere you didn't step on several at the same time. Even when we got downtown, there was no grass, nothing. The entire street looked like it was moving with all these locusts. We got out, and I just crunch, crunch, crunch as we walked in the store where Mother had to pick something up. And I remember as a kid, I just crunching all those locusts was just one of the most awful things. Them jump up all over you. It scared me, and as a young kid. But the real devastation isn't crunching on them or them jumping on you. It's that literally when a locust infestation goes along, they devour everything. Like our yard, they ate all the grass up. You know, they ate everything. There was nothing left on any of the trees. There was nothing green on any of the trees once they came. They just ate everything and then just moved right on through and continued to eat. So here, after they've been devastated by a hailstorm, here comes a locust infestation and just eat whatever's left on the ground or on the trees. And so literally the people have, after this, nothing of the crops of the year. Now, earlier, he'd mentioned this was the barley crop, etc. That helps us to date the time. That would be in late February, early March. So this probably all started late December, January, these plagues, and is now continuing down into March and into April. This is a several month a series of plagues that are occurring. But at this point, you know, what did Egypt have left? You know, its fertilization of crops had not worked out right at all. Their fish are dead, their animals are dead, their crops are destroyed. A lot of their people have died from the hail and from other things. I mean, the nation of Egypt is in terrible shape. And yet probably the scariest event was just about to occur. You have to keep in mind that the supreme god of the Egyptians was Ra, the god of the sun. And most of the time it's sunny in Egypt. And so they're used to lots of sun. And they believe that literally through religious acts that, you know, the god kind of died as the sun went down and went through the underworld and came back to life again. But what if the sun didn't come up and yet it was time for it? Well, Ra had been detained in the underworld, and some power greater than Ra and the pharaohs that had died that were at work to keep things going had all failed. And so the scariest thing probably is this plague that occurred next, because it was a plague of darkness.
Verse 21, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that the darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. But Moses said, you must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshiping the Lord our God. And until we get there, we will not know what we are to use to worship the Lord. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Pharaoh said to Moses, get out of my sight. make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. Just as you say, Moses replied, I will never appear before you again. Bruce, what would come of this great darkness?
Yeah, you think about it, this may have been, because it said they could feel it, that this may have been a terrible dust storm. And I've actually been in West Texas, a dust storm where you couldn't see the sun, where it was, completely dark. I remember as a little boy riding in the car, and this is when I would have been about 2 or 3. But my mother's driving down the highway and a terrible dust storm blowing, which wasn't unusual. We lived in a town named La Mesa, and lots of dust storms there. But anyway, we're driving down the highway. My mother was trying to get home, and the storm became so intense and so blinding, she could not see ahead. I remember her stopping and trying to kind of pull off the road, but she couldn't tell whether she's on the road or off the road. She couldn't see. And so we couldn't even see the hood ornament on the front of our car. And it just became that way. And it seemed, I don't know how long it lasted. I was a kid. For kids, it seemed like forever. And we were there and just in total darkness with this dust storm that blew through. So perhaps that's what happened. But 3 days, warning that Ra was no more in control, nor was Pharaoh. And again, he promised the moon, oh, you can all go. And of course, as soon as the darkness was gone, he hardened his heart, changed his mind, said, no way, you can't go. As a matter of fact, now he really threatens Moses and Aaron. He says, get out of my sight. If you come back, you're going to be dead men. So Pharaoh is through negotiating. He thinks he's taken every hit he can possibly take. What else can you possibly do to me and to the Egyptians? And so he said, we've endured this. We're not going to let you go. We're not going to give in to this God that is pressuring us with his plagues. And so Moses then says, I will never appear before you again. And of course, we're going to stop before the final plague because it's special and we want to highlight that, and we'll be focusing on that next week. But truly, Moses will not appear before him, and Pharaoh will grant their wish that they can leave. But again, after they've been gone a while, he'll change his mind again. But this will lead to the destruction of his army in the waters that will engulf them. So there's a lot more to look at, but I think we've got a good overview of these terrible plagues that completely devastated at this point Egypt. It had knocked out everything that would be possible to sustain life. And yet Pharaoh was so prideful, stubborn, and hard-hearted that he still wouldn't let the slave people of Israel go. But this will not last. The final plague in the Red Sea will take care of Pharaoh with a complete humiliation in the end. So this conflict between the gods of Egypt and the one true and living God, it's God 9, Pharaoh, and the gods of Egypt 0. They're getting whipped every time there's a competition, and it's only their hard-heartedness. And even as officials and people begin to see, this is a no-win proposition. We need to give in to these demands. Only Pharaoh is still stubborn enough to resist the will of the living God. But I want to highlight, instead of, we talked last week about hard-heartedness, and we talked about how the Bible both says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And we talked about how that is, that God brings something into a person's life to call them to do something they definitely don't want to do. And so they harden their heart, but God hardened their heart by giving them that decision to make. But what I want to highlight as we close this time is the opposite side. And that is, notice time and again, Moses intervened in prayer for the Egyptians and ended their suffering after each one of these plagues. We find the intervention of Moses, the end of the suffering for the people of Egypt. And we have to remember that we need to treat our enemies, not just our friends, well. And it reminds me of what Jesus said in what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. John, if you have that.
Beginning at verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
So Jesus is saying, well, some people say, yeah, you love your neighbors, but then they're your enemies. You can't possibly love your enemy. You hate your enemy. But that's not how God is. You know, God didn't hate the Egyptians. You know, God loved the Egyptians too, but he knew their idol worship, their pride, their foolish sense of omnipotence and how they could control things were all a lie. And so on top of that, they had oppressed his people, his special people. And when asked to let the people go, they refused to let them go. So God forced Pharaoh's hand. But even with all these plagues, there was grace. There was the intervention of Moses to end the darkness, to end the plague of the flies, to end each of these severe things. So there's still grace in the midst of this. And so it's a lesson we should learn. If we want to be like God, we have to learn not only to pray for friendly neighbors, but also be willing to pray for our enemies, even those who persecute us. We shouldn't be wishing ill towards people that oppose us. We should be praying for them, praying that they'll have a heart change, praying that they'll see the light, praying that God will bless them so that they can experience the grace and love of God. Let's never forget that lesson, that even in the midst of this severe punishment, God's grace was seen in the prayers of Moses on behalf of relieving the suffering for the Egyptian people. And so let us never forget that that's our role too, as ambassadors of Christ, to never forget to pray for everyone, including our enemies. John, will you close us out with a word of prayer?
Yes, sir. Father, we come to you humbly after learning a little deeper on this story of Pharaoh's hardened heart and God's continual presence, your continual presence, as you've shown yourself through your vessels, Moses and Aaron. Lord, let us be always aware that these are tragic moments for those who did not respect you. So Lord, let us continue to love our enemies and all those who would put themselves at enmity with you, and pray for them that they may have a changed heart, that they may know you and the power of resurrection through your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, we thank you for the lesson taught by Bruce, that we might grow closer to you through this study. Let us continue to bond with one another in preparation to spend eternity with you. We ask that you bless us, keep us, and guide us. For it is in Christ's holy name we ask this prayer. Amen.